Okay, it's working. Perfect. So I was talking about this new approach on the territory, which is geography of discontent or resentment, because it studied the way a set of issues um, influences the way voters choose. And there's been an increasing choice of this kind of nationalist populist parties. So in the next 15 minutes, I will drive you through a short journey. First, how do we define populism? Perhaps many of you are familiar with it. The concept is somewhat controversial in political science, but there is a more commonly accepted definition, which is that populism consists on the creation of a dichotomy between the people and an elite or an alleged elite, which is seen as selfish and distant from the common people, and sometimes corrupt. And this creates us, the people, versus them, the ruling classes or the elite. This is the definition by Kazmud, which is kind of pioneering in the question. But then we have two types of populism, and that is important because this first dyadic populism, it is the one that opposes the people to the elite, is more typical to the left-wing parties, which are sometimes categorized as radical left-wing parties or extremist parties. And then we have this kind of triadic populism because in this electoral discourse, we don't have just two groups, but the movements, the parties, or the politicians that make their claims to the voting people, they put up a third group besides the people and the ruling classes that usually are foreign groups, ethnic minorities, sometimes minorities that have been in the countries for centuries, as it happens in Portugal. And this kind of populism is more typical of these new right-wing parties that are having a huge electoral success. So these new rights electoral discourse, what they choose to tell the people, it challenges the globalist liberalism in the name of a set of questions, which are, for the sake of brevity, resumed in the issues relating to sovereignty, cultural and national identity, and on the other hand, the economic issues that are related to the impact of the economic globalization on their countries, and specifically on some territories more than others. And so, in this later case, these concerns that are reflected in the far-right electoral speech, they used to be typical from left-wing parties. For instance, in the 2016 campaign for the presidency of the United States, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, they shared the concern about foreign trade that was eroding the industrial basis. And for Bernie Sanders, the problem was the quality of jobs, unemployment, and so on, declining revenues for the working classes. So keeping this in mind, we, in the right side of the board, we have this graph about, how people in a set of European countries see that growing diversity makes their country a better place to live or not. And in some countries, there is a majority which says it makes it a worse place. And we never have countries where the majority said it would be a better place. We have a huge group of people in between in many countries which don't make up their minds about this. But was in 2016, a long way ago, okay? But this explains also why these parties are having electoral success. In this graph, we see in red the far left populist share of vote in a set of European countries between 1998 and 2018. And in blue, it's the share of voting for far-right parties, also populists, also in 1998 to 2018. So we can see it's much bigger than the share of the far left. And, well, there's a growing trend, clearly, more on the right side than on the left side. Then, well, this is somehow hidden, but in the left side of the board, you have main features of these typical voters for these populist right-wing parties, okay, based on a set of countries. They tend to be white people more than other colored people, elderly people, working class people with low incomes, and poorly educated people. Well, if also 20 or 30 years ago, some left-wing parties would have this kind of profile too. Then, what kind of contexts of territories produce more of this kind, or have more of this kind of voters? Well, mainly territories which are typical regions affected by disindustrialization, lack of industry. They used to be strongholds of industries, but industry is decaying. Many people has falling incomes, and there is lasting unemployment in a lot of regions. And this is the regions that produce these kinds of voters, mainly on these right-wing nationalist parties. So this is the subject of this kind of geography of this content. You have here a set of authors, if someone is interested. Well, this has put the globalization at stake at the moment, even before the pandemics and before the war in Ukraine. Okay, so we have a statement for Angel Gurria, who was the OECD Secretary General, well, telling us, please pay attention to this, because this is a backlash against globalization. Well, Trump had been elected, some trade agreements had been undone or were at risk at that time. Then there is a set of news that can be translated as a sign of deglobalization, also in result of this kind of discussions and this kind of approach, like Trump's approach. And but Biden signed a Buy American. This is not globalization, it's the opposite. So this was at the beginning of the pandemics, more or less. And we had other kind of the globalization that is linked more with technology and wars about technology. These guys, Apple, they would prefer to have sourced chips in the USA, and China with recently banned iPhones from government officials. But okay, that was a kind of a parallel question, but that reflects how these socioeconomic issues may impact on these international relations subjects, more in this case, more in economic relations, but that also translates in political relations. This also puts the European integration into question. In the graph, you see the share of votes in a set of countries in parties that were somehow opposed or strongly opposed to EU integration. And the point is, it was growing till 2018. And here begins the maps. In this map, you can see the share of votes. Well, I don't know if you can read it in parties that somehow opposed to EU integration. In green, well, they have less than 3% of voting share. In dark pink, they have more than 35. Okay, so I have to speed up. Well, this is also relates to differences between territories, because in territories that are more far away from big cities, productivity has declined and revenues also different from other territories. This is reflected in the Brexit vote, where we have the Remain vote concentrated in big metro areas, some other cities in Scotland, and the Brexit vote in peripheries and in the industrial northeast, which had lost a lot because of globalization and the industrialization. It's in France, the voting from Marine Le Pen is also the same kind of logic. Big cities. In blue is the voting for Macron in the 2017 elections. And in gray, in the betweens of the cities, the La France périphérique, we have the voting more for Marine Le Pen, more concentrated in there. So I'm just spinning up. In Portugal, this arose in 2019 with a new party called Chega, which in the first elections it ran to, it elected an MP, a member of the Portuguese parliament. And this happened in a context in which the voting for the central parties of the system, that are liberal parties, Partido Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Party, has shown a tendency to decline in this century. Okay, not going to the details, and the non-voters have been growing mostly. Then this speech of this party, it describes itself as a national conservative, liberal and personalist party in its first founding political manifesto. And they had a very liberal economic program, which is the opposite of some other parties in other countries that follow this kind of politics. And they have also an identitarian and conservative rhetorics about Portugal. And well, they wanted the prohibition of political and religious practice that offend the Portuguese legal system and European cultural roots. So very clear identity. Well, perhaps many of you don't recognize the map of Portugal. This is the Portuguese municipalities, and the dark places is where the voting for Chega was above or way above national voting for Chega, and the ones with the lighter shades are below. It's very curious because they had more voting in the south, which is the opposite of what usually happens with right-wing parties. So in this first election in 2019, this arises another question that many of these areas overlap with the voting for the Portuguese Communist Party, which is also strong in the south and in the inner south near Spain. It's Alentejo. In this first election, they have about 1.4% of the voting. In the election for the presidency of the Portuguese Republic, the head of Chega, André Ventura, he applied. He had 12% of the vote, almost 10,000, 10 times more. And this kind of concentration of the voting in the south, it can't diluted, but remains in the areas of the Communist Party. And in 2022 elections for the parliament also, it was an in-between, the first map and the second map, another concentration. Well, trying to make it short, we made an analysis with a set of variables, 45 variables, and based on correlations, we identified some signs of motivations of the voters. Okay, so there were signs of this has a strong similarity with what happens in another European countries, because there are some variables that show that there are discontent voters. This overlap with the Communist Party voting is a sign. There was an overlap also with the percentage of foreign population, mainly in 2019, which indicates that there were voters that didn't want perhaps that much of foreign population, and also an overlap with municipalities which have more people receiving income head from the state, which is well, never mind the names, but the idea is as the Portuguese state gives some income to people that are deprived, that don't have their own incomes, and where these people are more concentrated, there was more voting for this party, Chega. So the final remarks, similarities, differences. The difference is that there was no significant correlation with education levels in the voting for Chega, and there was a negative correlation with the aging index, opposite to what happened in those countries that we talked previously. On the other hand, we have these similarities, that is the importance of identity issues and the overlap with the discontents of the Communist Party, and also a negative correlations with the voting for the center parties, which would be to expect. And well, basically in Portugal, these voters seems to be more oriented to identitarian questions than to socio-economic questions. Okay, that is not always the case in other countries, and these characteristics were present in the 3 elections that we analyzed. Well, there are more to come. And well, this analysis has some limitations, but I think it's nevertheless useful. So thank you, and sorry for